Good evening. My name is Bill Whalen, and I am the chair of the Board of Trustees of the Gregorian University Foundation. On behalf of my fellow trustees, I welcome you to this evening's distinguished lecture series featuring Father James Keenan of the Society of Jesus. The Gregorian University Foundation is a US-based foundation that was established in 1972 to raise urgently needed funds for scholarships, academic chairs, libraries, and capital improvements for the Pontifical Jesuit higher education institutions in Rome. These include the Pontifical Gregorian University, the Pontifical Biblical Institute, and the Pontifical Oriental Institute. These three schools serve more than 3,800 students, women and men, lay and religious, from 150 countries, and are the largest center in the world for the training of church leadership and ministry, and are a world center of scholarship and research. They are where the church does its thinking. I invite you to learn more about the foundation and these three schools by visiting our website, gregorianfoundation.org, and of course, we would welcome your financial support. Please enjoy today's lecture. I now would like to introduce the president of the foundation, Father Michael McFarland of the Society of Jesus.
Thank you, Bill. This is the feast of Aloysius Gonzaga, the Jesuit saint who, while a student at the Roman College, now the Gregorian University, gave his life ministering to victims of the plague. So it's a very special day for us Jesuits. Therefore, I'm particularly pleased on this day to present our inaugural distinguished lecturer. Father James Keenan of the Society of Jesus is the Canisius chair and director of the Jesuit Institute at Boston College and vice provost for global engagement. A Jesuit priest since 1982, he attended the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, where he studied with Claus Demmer for a licentiate in 1984 and with Joseph Fuchs for a doctorate in 1988. He has edited or written 25 books and published over 400 essays, articles, and reviews. As founder of Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church, he chaired the international conferences in Padua in 2006, Trento in 2010, and Sarajevo 2018. In addition to Boston College, he has taught at Fordham University, John Carroll University, the Ateneo de Manila, Dharmaram in Bangalore, India, and at his alma mater, the Gregorian. Recently, he wrote University Ethics, How Colleges Can Build and Benefit from a Culture of Ethics, and has just finished editing two books, Building Bridges in Sarajevo, the plenary papers of Sarajevo 2018, and Street Homelessness and Catholic Theological Ethics. He is presently completing another book, A Brief History of Catholic Ethics. In addition to his impressive list of professional accomplishments, Father Keenan is a dedicated and compassionate pastor and friend to many. I know this from my own experience as he helped me through a very difficult personal crisis during a critical time in my formation. This is typical of the faculty of the Gregorian. Its graduates often speak of how much they appreciate and learn from the dedication, generosity, and care shown by their professors, an especially important factor for those preparing for service in the church. So on behalf of the Gregorian University Foundation, I'm proud to present our distinguished lecturer, Father James Keenan.
Thank you, Michael. It's a delight to be here with you all this evening. My thesis in this talk is that in education for ethical decision-making, vulnerability and recognition are necessary preconditions even before conscience comes into play. Let me start first with my introduction to the issue. I want to share with you an ongoing discovery that I'm having, if you will. Years ago, I became worried about teaching conscience formation. It seemed to me that we were designing conscience formation courses as if the students just needed a number of instructions. I began to see that we were thinking of conscience as a disposition, as something all the students had that we wanted to form. Now I'm beginning to think that conscience is not a disposition, but actually follows from some other disposition. Interestingly, Thomas Aquinas held the same position. As we will see, for him, conscience was not a disposition or a faculty, but rather an act. That is something we needed to do. I say this because I see some students who are responsive to the need for moral assistance, but others are not. If all have consciences, why do some respond and others do not? Moreover, what if they all take courses on conscience formation? Why is it that afterwards some respond to the need for moral assistance and others still do not? Failing to respond in the first place seems to be the predominant failure in human history. At least it appears that way in the Bible. People do not fail by responding. Rather, they fail beforehand. They fail to bother to respond in the first place. The priest and the Levite pass by the man on the road in the Good Samaritan parable. The goats don't see the hungry and the naked in Matthew 25. The rich man literally steps over Lazarus in Luke 16. None of them respond. It's not that they do something wrong, that they actually do something, rather they do nothing. They don't even seem to notice. Is there something that starts the ball rolling? Is there something about conscience formation that precedes the act of conscience, that considers, what am I to do? Is there something we are not forming that eventually gets one to act in the first place? I think the problem is that we think of the beginning of moral action as the conscience. But I now believe that the beginning of moral action is being vulnerably disposed to the other, and then subsequently recognizing the other. And then do we in conscience act? In other words, I think that there are two steps before acting in conscience: being vulnerably disposed and then actually recognizing the other. These are the preconditions to the conscience act. Let's return to the Good Samaritan parable. I do not know if the priest and the Levite could have acted in conscience, but I do know two things. Neither in their humanity were vulnerably disposed to the injured man, and neither gave him the recognition that he was injured and in need. On the other hand, the Good Samaritan's first recognition of the injured man gives evidence of his vulnerability to the wounded man. Then, after he recognized the man as being in need, he, in his conscience, went about the details of what he needed in conscience to do. Acting in conscience, he needed to figure out how to clean the wounds, how to get this man to a safe place, how to make inquiries about the appropriate place in which to leave him, how to negotiate and secure from the innkeeper his oversight of the injured man, how to dispense with his own funds, how to redesign his return to this particular inn so as to take the man with him, etc., etc. The Good Samaritan's conscience got a workout. But the work of his conscience only began when his vulnerable disposition recognized the man. The recognition led then to the conscience question, now what do I do? One reason why we do not see what precedes the conscience is because, disregarding Thomas Aquinas, we ethicists think of conscience as essentially both a faculty or disposition and an act. We think of conscience as something that one has and as something one does. I know I did, but I don't anymore. I think something else precedes conscience, a vulnerable disposition, and then the act of vulnerability, that is recognizing another. In the Summa Theologiae, Thomas wrote that conscience was not a power or a faculty or a disposition, but simply an act. According to him, when we act in conscience, we try to descend into the particulars about what our moral response should be. I agree with that. In the Summa, in the article prior to the one on conscience, Thomas asked about a closely related aspect of the moral life called synderesis. There he argued that prior to conscience, synderesis is a habit that inclines us to the good and murmurs at evil. This initial habit is for Thomas what eventually launches the act of conscience. Like Thomas, I want to argue that something precedes conscience that inclines us toward the good, toward the neighbor. Thomas called this inclination synderesis. I want to explore what that something is in different, more contemporary terminology so that we can better educate our students. What the goats, what the rich man, what the priest and the Levite have in common is that they were not vulnerable to and did not recognize another. That is the homeless and the naked, the poor Lazarus, or even the wounded stranger. If they had recognized these humans as such, then they would have needed in conscience to figure out what ethics wanted from them. I believe, however, that these instances of overlooking others happen precisely because these agents were not prompted to see or imagine the others as being like them. In that same moment, they gave themselves permission not to be bothered by the others or by their situation. Lacking the vulnerable disposition and the habit of recognizing these people, they passed them by. They knew ethics, but only for those whose dignity they recognized. The priest and Levite probably for their colleagues, the rich man for his business partners. They are not interested in ethics for those whom they do not recognize. If they recognize them as worthy, then they think about ethics, otherwise not. What we have to address is their particular indifference, their lack of vulnerability and recognition. We need to tap their vulnerability and then train them to recognize others beyond family, friends, and caste. In what follows, I want to first examine vulnerable dispositions and then recognition. So first, vulnerability. Like many others, when I first thought of vulnerability, I considered it singularly as being wounded, as primarily a condition that raises in others alarm and concern. From the writings of Judith Butler, the philosopher, among others, I began to see vulnerability as less being wounded and more being responsive. When I recognized that the word vulnerable does not mean having been wounded, but rather being able to be wounded, then I began to see how it means being exposed to the other. In this sense, vulnerability is the human condition that allows me to hear, encounter, receive, or respond to the other, even to the point of being injured. Being human is being vulnerable. Being vulnerable should not be reduced to being precarious, that is, being in an unstable or risky situation where the possibility or the continuation of harm occurs. Judith Butler realizes that too many people think of vulnerability as primarily being in an unstable context. She rather wants us to understand that all of us as human beings are vulnerable to one another. And precisely when one's vulnerability is at risk, we vulnerably respond to them. So wisely, she distinguishes precarity as a moment of risk for the vulnerable human. She notes, quote, precarity exposes our sociality, the fragile and necessary dimensions of our interdependency. Certainly, in being vulnerable, we have the capacity to encounter and respond to another whose vulnerability is precarious, as in the prodigal son parable, where the son's own precarity is evident. But while the beginning of that parable focuses on the younger brother's precarity, the center of the parable emerges as we recognize the vulnerability of the father, who recognizes his son in the distance, embraces him, reincorporates him, and works to restore all that was unstable, threatened, exposed, and jeopardized. Like the vulnerable Good Samaritan, the vulnerable father of the prodigal son recognizes his son as the precarious one, a humanity not recognized by those who left him to eat with the pigs. Butler recognizes how fundamentally foundational vulnerability is. She writes, quote, Ethical obligation not only depends upon our vulnerability to the claims of others, but establishes us as creatures who are fundamentally defined by that ethical relation. Vulnerability is what defines and establishes us as capable of being moral among one another. Again, emphasizing the priority of vulnerability, she contends, quote, "The ethical relation is not a virtue that I have or exercise. It is prior to any individual's sense of self. It is not as discrete individuals that we honor this ethical relation. I am already bound to you. And this is what it means to be the self I am, receptive to you in ways that I cannot fully predict or control. Vulnerability essentially is what most qualifies myself as being bound to and among others." She returns to the priority of vulnerability as prior even to the moan from another in need. She writes, "You call upon me and I answer. But if I answer, it was only because I was already answerable. That is, this susceptibility and vulnerability constitutes me at the most fundamental level and is there, we might say, prior to any deliberate decision to answer the call. In other words, one has to be already capable of receiving the call before actually answering it. In this sense, ethical responsibility presupposes ethical responsiveness. Our vulnerability is our answerability, what allows us and prompts us to recognize, to respond, to communicate, in short, to love. Theologically, Butler's natural created answerableness resonates with a variety of creation narratives that capture the creation of the vulnerable human. Though not from a theologian, T.H. White's wonderful The Once and Future King provides an account of creation that captures this creation of vulnerability beautifully. On the sixth day of creation, God gathers all the embryos of each and every species of animal life. As embryos, they are rolling around all over the place and all look like one another. But God offers each embryo of each species the opportunity to ask for an addition that will distinguish their species. The giraffe embryo asks for and gets a long neck for tree food. The porcupine asks for quills for protection. And so it goes for the entire day, for the entire animal kingdom. The last embryo is the human, Adam, who, when asked by God what Adam wants, Adam responds, "I think that you made me in the shape which I now have for reasons best known to yourselves, and that it would be rude to change. I will stay a defenseless embryo all my life." God is delighted with Adam and lets the human embryo have no particular protection, to be the most vulnerable of all newborns, and says, "As for you, Adam, you will look like an embryo till they bury you." Behind White's imaginative portrayal of creation is his remarkable vision of the human embryo as the bearer of human vulnerability. By positing the human as willing to remain vulnerable, White is able to disclose further God's delight in that the human now is in God's image, precisely because of the decision to stay as a defenseless embryo all my life. White concludes his account with God revealing to the human, "Adam, eternally undeveloped, you will always remain potential in our image, able to see some of our sorrows and to feel some of our joys. We are partly sorry for you, man, but partly hopeful." Human dignity, rooted in the image of God, participates in the vulnerability of God. This insight of our vulnerability being connected to God's resonates with the great late Irish theologian Enda McDonough's work called Vulnerable to the Holy in Faith, Hope, Morality, and Art. There he begins his treatment on vulnerability with God. God reveals to us in God's self as vulnerable by the birth of Jesus in Bethlehem, his life in Nazareth, and his death in Golgotha. Thus, sounding like White, McDonough writes that to be made in God's image is to be made vulnerable. Our dignity is rooted in God's vulnerability. Now, recognition. Besides theology and philosophy, the literature on vulnerability expands elsewhere. For this presentation, I want to turn for a moment to the work on gender and domination and the psychoanalyst and feminist theorist Jessica Benjamin, who reflected on infancy and mutual recognition among infants. Mutual recognition is that central experience of infants being among infants. After being for months the object of attention of people much bigger than themselves, basically giants, mutual recognition is where an infant finally encounters another that seems very much like her or himself, and yet not. They want to touch the face of the other child. They are fascinated that this child in front of them is just like them. They mutually recognize each other. In that moment of mutual recognition, they discover their humanity. Benjamin writes, mutual recognition is the most vulnerable point in the process of human differentiation. She adds, in mutual recognition, the subject accepts the premise that others are separate, but nonetheless share like feelings and intentions. In this work, Benjamin sought to explore ways of restoring mutual recognition as the defining key for understanding right relationship between genders. In a more recent work in 2017, she turns again to mutual recognition and, among other matters, finds the language of vulnerability key for recuperating and restoring the experience of mutual recognition. As we mature, the experience of mutual recognition can and should happen time and again as part of our growth as moral agents. The mutual recognition in infancy becomes the foundation for subsequent expressions of due recognition whenever we encounter humanity in its greatest precarity or neglect. From that first recognition where we acknowledge the others and our own humanity, we learn to develop a sense that the other in need is another human being. Of course, as we saw earlier in the biblical stories, overlooking the humanity of another is what gives us the unfortunate permission to withhold due recognition. Thus, the work of education is to help one another to be vulnerable and vigilant enough so that due recognition and appropriate response to the other is actualized as the worthy alternative to the customary but harmful stance of overlooking or neglect. The philosopher Patty McQueen explains recognition as an insight, a practice that develops, going from first being an awakening to second, making a form of identification, to third, to finally appreciating a responsible relationship that broadens our own self-understanding. Let me repeat that. Recognition is first an awakening that makes a form of identification and then finally appreciates a responsible relationship that broadens our self-understanding. McQueen writes, the term recognition has several distinct meanings. One, an act of intellectual apprehension, such as when we recognize we have made a mistake or we recognize the influence of religion on American politics. Two, a form of identification, as when we recognize a friend in the street. And three, the act of acknowledging or respecting another being, such as when we recognize someone's status, achievements, or rights. The philosophical and political notion of recognition predominantly refers to three, and is often taken to mean that not only is recognition an important means of valuing and respecting another person, it is also fundamental to understanding ourselves. McQueen's move from recognizing someone familiar to giving recognition to one to whom it is due, I think, is the threshold into the moral life. What we learn in infancy is literally a first lesson. In our vulnerability, we recognize that we are related one to another. Then we move from an awakening to a form of identification. Later, as children, we realize that that form of identification calls us to a form of responsiveness, especially when the other is neglected, in need, or oppressed. The awakening to and the identification with another's humanity are therefore the first steps across the moral threshold. We can return to the prodigal son parable to uncover recognition's rich relationship with both the vulnerable and the familiar. In the parable, as the vulnerable father attends to the prodigal son, he remains vulnerable to his older son as well, who does not suffer from precarity, but from dominance, which expresses itself in the older brother's resentment. Still, we should not think that the father is surprised by the older son's resentment. So many people think that the father is surprised. When he sees his younger son in the distance, the father knows that his movement toward the younger son will surely trigger the older son's own insecurities that are covered by his dominance. Here, then, we recognize the father's own vulnerability that anchors both sons. The stability in the story is the vulnerable father, as the precarious son returns and the resentful one tries to leave. The enduringly vigilant, attentive, and responsible father is so because he is vulnerable. So when the older son refers to his brother as that son of yours, the father wants him to recognize his brother and says, this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. But the brother needs to be vulnerable before he can recognize. Without it, due recognition just does not happen. One of my doctoral students reintroduced me to the notion of due recognition. In a paper he delivered in Rwanda in the summer of 2019, entitled 25 Years After the Genocide, Can Rwanda Embrace an Ethics of Recognition? The Nigerian Hilary Naiwanya developed this fundamental insight because he wanted to recognize not only the victims of the genocide, but also the reformed, penitent perpetrators. He noted that in Rwanda, there was recognition of those harmed, but not for those who, through restorative justice, were seeking reinsertion back into their community, wanting to be recognized as such. Till now, they remained ignored, overlooked, and neglected. Naiwanya notes that our human dignity is established socially by an appreciation of our interrelatedness. Borrowing from the philosopher Charles Taylor, he argues that in the context of shared human dignity, due recognition is not then just a courtesy we owe people, which we can confer or reserve at will, but rather a vital human need. When we fail to give due recognition, we often add to the oppression of the other, whose own situation might well be related to our own, though we fail to acknowledge it. Recognition becomes then a moment not only of the engaged awareness of another's situation, but also of the self-reflective awareness of my relationship to that other and her or his situation. So how do we correct the gaze? How do we answer the call to recognition? Why is it that our cultures, like the biblical ones, let people fail to recognize their neighbor in need? The questions of cultures insulating us from the need to bother to recognize our neighbor was raised in the United States nearly 90 years ago by one of the most famous Protestant American ethicists, Reinhold Niebuhr. In 1932, he warned ethicists that they lacked, quote, an understanding of the brutal character of the behavior of all human collectives and the power of self-interest and collective egoism in all intergroup relations. There, in Moral Man and Immoral Society, a study in ethics and politics, Niebuhr insisted that we do not see, quote, the limitations of the human imagination, the easy subservience of reason to prejudice and passion, and the consequent persistence of irrational egoism, particularly in group behavior. In many ways, we go on teaching today, 90 years later, failing to heed the forces that empower, quote, the inequalities of privilege that are greater than could possibly be defended rationally. It is in the interest of such forces that we continue to fail to recognize those whose inequities pay the price of our privilege. No wonder that we rarely recognize. Yet, reason is often invoked precisely to defend such inequalities of privilege, and thus to keep us from giving the due recognition to others. In her stunning critique of Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, another student of mine, Kate Ward, teaching at Marquette, describes Smith's contempt for, quote, those whining and melancholy moralists who call attention to the suffering of the distant others. She notes how he considers the moralist sympathy for those misfortunes absurd and unreasonable and irresistibly unnatural. The father of capitalism understood well the importance of keeping our gaze from those who are victims of privilege. Isabel Wilkerson, in her magnificent new book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontent, takes us further than Niebuhr and provides us with the image of the wordless usher, whose flashlight keeps our gaze focused, this wordless usher, not letting our eyes avert to any lower caste whom we dare not recognize. She writes, as we go about our daily lives, caste is the wordless usher in a darkened theater, flashlight cast down in the aisles, guiding us to our assigned seats for a performance. Our social structures prompt us to look and recognize what they want us to see. Niebuhr and Wilkerson remind us how prevalent the forces are that keep us from reverting our gaze and discovering a mutual recognition in the other whose condition we are socially trained to ignore. Recognition is therefore the act that liberates the vulnerability of the agent and the other in the face of the distorting power of the caste and social systems that structure our lives. We need to educate our students about just how pervasively the wordless usher deflects the gaze of due recognition. For indeed, our societies train us, as Niebuhr and Wilkerson try to let us know, not to see the one who has been overlooked. If we want to teach our students that they need to be vulnerably disposed so as to mutually recognize the neighbor long overlooked, we need to heed the structures that prompt them not to bother to recognize in the first place. Let me give two examples of my own discovery of the prevalence of what I call the politics of overlooking. First, Black Lives Matter, and second, the most ignored people in the world, the homeless. Black Lives Matter is effectively a clarion call that white America has politically neglected the physical and often deadly assault on Black lives by police and by white supremacists. The protests are shocking precisely because they want to awaken in us a recognition of the situation. The movement started with the death of George Floyd, a video caught and stayed fixated on a police officer kneeling on the neck of another human being, George Floyd, in broad daylight. How could we not recognize that action? Yet Black Lives Matter wanted us to not only recognize that George Floyd died at the hands of police, but that other Black men and women did, and that their deaths were also not recognized. To train us in recognizing the unjust killing of Black men and women, Black Lives Matter was formed, and marches summoning us to recognize these deaths were launched. Within the protests was the kneeling of 9 minutes and 29 seconds to make it impossible to dismiss the act as anything but an assault on human life that in many Americans' mind did not matter. Black Lives Matter was a way of forcing American white people to acknowledge that George Floyd mattered, as did Ahmaud Arbery or Breonna Taylor. Black Lives Matter prompts us to recognize how these people died and how until this moment we could simply overlook these killings and not take note. Taking note, that's exactly what the rich man, the goats, the priest, and the Levite, and the prodigal son's older brother did not do. They never took note of the other. Now the second example, This is anybody who acknowledges the way they overlook, it's always embarrassing. In 2017, I was among 20 Catholic ethicists invited by Mark McGreevy, the founder of the Institute for Global Homelessness, to a conference in Rome on street homelessness. He initiated the conference informing us. So there's about 60 people in this gathering, and there's about 20 of us who are ethicists, and it's an international gathering. He initiated the conference informing us that not one ethicist in the Catholic Church had ever bothered to recognize in her or his writings the plight of the homeless. This is remarkable. Not one of the more than 1,700 Catholic ethicists around the world ever wrote on the plight of the homeless. Like others, we walk by the homeless. We overlook them. We make believe that they are not in the street right in front of us. The conference was effectively a call for us to consider whence the politics of overlooking the homeless, a fairly universal practice, even by those like me, who are dedicated to recognizing those on the margins. The politics of overlooking is, as Niebuhr and Wilkerson explain, a common reflex action. So let me come to a conclusion. We need to explore much more often the multitudinous ways that we get accustomed to the normal, where those beneath us go unnoticed because we think that we are above them. In a way, we need to learn and then teach one another lessons for the practice of recognizing, a new virtue of vigilance that reminds us that recognition can be unsettling, but brings us closer to Christ, a point to close this lecture. In the Gospels, recognition is always connected to Jesus Christ. For Matthew, because the sheep recognized the hungry, they were saved for feeding Christ. Indeed, that is what the Gospels ask for us, to recognize Jesus Christ. Recognition is in our tradition the way we find in him ourselves. Let me conclude as I started with the Good Samaritan parable. The parable is an odd one because its end is, unless we are not attentive, really a reversal of the beginning. The parable is answering the question, who is my neighbor? And so as the story begins, we quickly begin to think that the neighbor is the wounded man on the road. But by the end, the reversal is complete. And now the scribe, and not Jesus, is asked the question by Jesus. And the scribe answers that the neighbor is the one who shows mercy. Jesus's parable teaches us not to look for a neighbor to love, but rather to be a neighbor who loves. We recognize that answer because when hearing the story, we see that the center of the story is no longer the man lying wounded on the road, but rather this amazing Samaritan. We make the shift to the Samaritan because in hearing the story, we cannot get over how vulnerable and merciful his recognition is. Throughout the tradition, many preachers and theologians saw in the story of the Good Samaritan an allegory in miniature of our redemption by Christ, a story of what Christ has accomplished for us. Now, this allegory started in about the 3rd, 4th century and lasted until the 16th century. So I'm going to just conclude on this allegory. And I want to ask you, did you ever hear the Good Samaritan parable told this way? The basic allegorical expression of the parable is this: the man who lies on the road is the exiled Adam, wounded by sin, suffering outside the gates of Eden. The priest and the Levite are the law and the prophets, who pass him by because they are unable to do anything for Adam. Along comes the Good Samaritan, Christ, a foreigner, not one from here, who tends to Adam's wounds, which is salvation, takes him to the inn, which is the church, gives a down payment of 2 denarii, which are the 2 commandments of love, leaves him with the innkeeper, who is St. Paul, and promises to return for him the second coming, when he will pay in full our redemption and take him with him into the kingdom. Though often forgotten today, this interpretation of the parable shows us that it is first a narrative of Jesus's redemptive work for us, and then a call to imitation. The parable reveals that Jesus was first vulnerable to me when he recognized me on the road. The recognition of Jesus makes possible my recognition of others. This is the lesson we must never forget. Once we allow ourselves to be vulnerable to the other, we begin the work and life of conscience. Conscience finds its foundation by being vulnerable first, open and responsive to the other, capacious to the variety of ways that we are called to be human. In that vulnerability, we become like the Good Samaritan, able to hear the cry for help, or like the father who sees his prodigal on the horizon. The birth of Christian conscience is in the vulnerable recognition of humanity. And once we are vulnerable, we can recognize. It is then recognition that gives conscience its legs. In the story of the Good Samaritan, we get a glimpse of Christ's vulnerability and conscientious recognition of the wounded man, Adam. Still, the details of the narrative need to be filled out. Those details about cleansing and bandaging the wounds, the search for a place for the wounded man to mend, the even more difficult investigation for an innkeeper capable of trust and care and prudence, the finding of the funds to return to the inn, and the resolution to bring wounded Adam home with him. All these meticulous details are the stuff of conscience, the working out of human vulnerability, wherein we recognize and live out our shared humanity. And therein is the work of moral education. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much, Jim. There's a lot to think about there, a lot to explore. We do have some questions. One, you talk about moral education. Of course, you just finished a book on that. Could you give our listeners some suggestions about how they can use this as to improve moral education in the family, in the schools, high school, college, or even earlier? I know there's a lot of concern about children not getting the kind of moral education they need. Do you have any practical guidance for that?
Well, I think language is really key. And what I do, I teach on the virtues. I find that in the home, parents teach their children virtues. They say, try to be nice, try to be kind, try to be friendly, try to respect, try to be humble. I think the language of virtue is really very, very helpful. It's basic, but it's really key. There's a lot of work, I would say that actually in about 1970, there was an enormous shift to doing more and more work on virtue. We tend to think ethics is about rules, and it is in part. We need rules, just as we say to a child, it's 7 p.m., time for you to go to bed. Why now? But the rule is there. That's a rule that we want to give. And we give one another rules, like don't cross, at this intersection unless there's a green light. There's all rules that are very important. And we tend to think of ethics as rules. But I think when we use the language of virtue, we're able to talk to people about, for instance, what does hospitality mean? Like, what does hospitality mean now in light of the pandemic? I have a Jesuit who's coming here in 2 days. He's not vaccinated. He's coming from Burundi. I've now spent the past 4 days trying to figure out how I can get him here safely and quarantined and get a vaccine. Hospitality is a virtue that I think if we started teaching one another more and more what it means, I think we come closer to what good education is about. And students like that. They like to have key words. They like to have a certain sense that they hear something that they've always heard in an old way. They want to hear it new. So I would say moral education, if I want to talk about moral education, I would strike it up in terms of virtue. So vigilance is one. The language of vigilance is the language of recognition. And, I think, for instance, in the 16th century, there used to be these great handbooks on moral education. And they were always about beware the word, the flesh, and the devil. And the devil depended on which tradition you were in. If you were a Catholic, the devil on the cover was either Martin Luther or John Calvin. If you were a Protestant, the devil was a Jesuit. But what they were really trying to teach you is to be vigilant. Their vigilance was a vigilance to be careful of, to avoid following someone. I think we need a new vigilance of why am I so uncomfortable about these people? Why am I so able to not think about these people? Language, virtue words help us to open up a discussion. It's not that fraught with tension. It allows us to explore what I would call ordinary life. And the closer ethicists are to talking about ordinary life, the closer we are to moral education, which happens in the home.
What about things like service learning or insertion into other communities? Does that help at all with education?
I mean, we have, here at Boston College, we have more students who go to service learning in their spring break than to a beach. I mean, men and women for others is our mantra, and students do take it really seriously. And I think it's key for their own formation. I think that there's a lot of issues that we need to look at, how we incorporate that experience into their academic work. So many times it seems to be a tangent or an aside, and it needs to be more and more integrated. And it needs to be more integrated by how we see whether or not our students are unable to understand how others live. However, I do want to say that just because you send them abroad doesn't mean they're going to recognize anything. A student who goes abroad may end up really liking the gelati, but they may not see the poverty. So there's a certain way that we have to be thinking, how do we engage one another to see? And that's why I think it's about asking one another in ordinary language what it takes for us to recognize another in need. And what are the different factors that animate us? We have to get closer to home.
Good, thank you. We had one question about how what you're talking about, vulnerability and recognition, relates to empathy. Are they the same thing, or are they related? Does one lead to another?
Yeah, empathy, like solidarity, are words of vulnerability. If I'm empathetic, I'm vulnerable. If I'm in solidarity, I'm vulnerable to another. I stand with another. Accompaniment, the language of accompaniment. These are all words. These are all virtue words, what I was saying earlier. Empathy is about tapping somebody's vulnerability. When we say somebody is empathetic, you know, we're talking about their vulnerability. We're talking about this one feature that I've been looking at, vulnerability. Hannah Arendt, the great philosopher, did her work on empathy. I think that empathy kept coming up during the Second World War. What was it that allowed people to recognize those who were in need? I was trained in Rome at the Gregorian, and at the Gregorian, you could, during your summers, go to do parish work outside of Italy. And so I would go to Germany every summer, and I would go to this one little dorf called Untererdal in the town district of Hammelburg. It was about 70 kilometers from Würzburg. And I had the same parish every September for 3 years. And while I was there, there were only 800 people in that parish. That was Untererdal, and then there were 400 in the neighboring parish of Obererdal. But in my 3 Septembers, I did 11 funerals. I was a new priest, and that's why I wanted to do this. And I did 11 funerals. Every funeral was marked by the family's role during the Second World War. if it was a family that recognized people who needed to be protected and hidden, everybody showed up at the funeral. If it was a family that somewhat compromised, some came and some didn't. And if it was a family that reported others, no one showed up. I was there from 83 to 86, 40 years after the war. But the experience of empathy, human empathy, is something that we do recognize in others. And we have to ask, how is it that some people's empathy allows them to be so affected that they risk their lives? But that's what we're asking for in Jesuit education.
Good. You referenced your time at the Gregorian. Do you want to talk some about what that meant to you and how that formed your own thinking and your own career?
Yeah. Going to the Greg was a great experience. I was 20. What was I? I was 29 when I went to the Greg. I had just been ordained a priest, and I never really traveled. I had learned some Italian. I had to take 5 courses, all taught in Italian my first semester. I didn't know anything that was going on. Talk about being vulnerable. I had it more precarious. I had to ask friends for their notes for the whole time. And I would have these big names like Fuchs and Demmer and the others in my classes and stuff like that. So I felt myself very vulnerable. It's really something when you're the guest and you're hosted by others, and you can recognize who's gracious to you and who isn't. And I can't remember those who weren't, but I do remember those who were. I think that humanity really appreciates graciousness, the extension to us. And so I remember the faculty who were really gracious, who were most of them, who would be really go out of their way. My mentor, Fuchs, would call me up and say, I think it's time for you and some of your classmates to come over to my room and tell me some stories. And it was all a pretense for him to support us. And then Demmer would do the same. So for me, I think what I needed was some hospitality and some understanding. I also needed to be provoked. I needed to think outside the box. And both Fuchs and Demmer really helped me to do that, but so did quite a number of others, that I had there. There was Jerry Wicks, there was Frank Sullivan. It was really a wonderful time to just see how people reached out. I lived in the Bellarmino. And the Bellarmino is where the Jesuits who are priests, most of them are priests, almost all of them are priests. If you're not yet a priest, you're at the Jesuit. But if you are doing graduate studies, in other words, not just the first cycle of theology, but now the license and or the doctorate, you go to the Bellarmino where they're mostly priests. I lived with 120 guys for 5 years. We were from all these different countries. We would sit at table at lunch at Pranzo, and we would all speak in Italian, kind of, really in a horrendous way, the poor Italians. But then in the evening, we could sit at language tables. What was really great about that was those who mingled, who sat at the Spanish table when Spanish was their third language, because maybe English was their first and Italian was their second, but they wanted to be with the Spanish speakers and so forth, that we mingled with one another when we took some chances. And I'd say that my formation with the Bellarmino was really a tremendous event of learning how to be an ethicist, by learning what it meant to be guest, so I could figure out what to be host. That parish, I got a letter this past week from a woman who would help me prepare my homilies in Germany. I would have to I had to give these sermons in German. And I had this woman who decided to volunteer to listen to my awful sermons and to tell me, she would say all the time, James, ich habe keine Ahnung. I have no idea what you're saying. And yet it was her hospitality to me that taught me how to preach well so that people could understand what I was saying. And we're in correspondence today, 40 years later. The experience at the Greg was an experience that opened up a lot of different relations that continue to shape me.
Okay, good. One more question. You talked about the vulnerability of God,
Yeah.
and how our human vulnerability images that. That, I think, to some people would be a startling notion. I mean, we tend to think of God as impassive, as above all hurt or all weakness. But the biblical God is different, isn't it?
Yeah, and I have another doctoral student. This guy is Federico. He's from Italy. He's doing his dissertation on the vulnerable God, the image of a vulnerable God. He says, we say at Mass, I believe in the Father Almighty. And he says, doesn't sound terribly vulnerable. What would happen if we said, I believe in the vulnerable God? And you know, like if you look at iconography, you'll see Christ crucified on the cross. And when you see Christ crucified on the cross, there is vulnerability. But behind him, you see God the Father in almost regal robes with a crown and all. And you see that the overall view of God is dominant. And in fact, the next scenes, you'll see Christ now sitting on the throne next to God the Father. That's our iconography. That's not scriptural. That's what we've done. How do we get to the vulnerability of Christ on the cross, of the vulnerability of God the Father when Christ is crucified? And if we get closer to that, we can get closer to what it means to have that dangerous self-understanding of what it means to be a Christian, because then that means we're really vulnerable.
Great. Well, I think with that, we'll have to wrap it up. Unfortunately, this could go on for hours, and I hope it will. I hope people will talk to each other and think and pray about this, because there's so much here. So thank you very much, Jim and Bill. And thank you all for joining us on this, our inaugural event in the Distinguished Lecture Series. I hope it's given you a sense of the impressive quality and depth of the academic work done at the Gregorian and its impact on the church and the world, but also how it's rooted in and then nourishes our own faith, which is so important to us. To learn more, I'd urge you to please check out our website at www.gregorianfoundation.org and consider if you can help us by supporting this work. Thank you all and have a wonderful night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for this thought-provoking lecture. Have a good evening.